Hello, welcome to Türkiye Talks. We will be discussing the international system, the crisis of the international system today. As you all know, UN General Assembly meetings are happening in New York, and next week the world leaders will be delivering their speeches. Last year, the UN General Assembly was done completely online, but this year there will be in-person meetings, although the attendance may be lower because of the COVID-19 challenges. We will be discussing today with Professor Talip Küçükcan the challenges before the international community, the crisis of the international system in terms of how the institutions are able to respond to the global challenges, including the climate change, the COVID-19 crisis, various conflicts throughout the world, the refugee challenge, internally displaced people around the world. So there are many challenges, and in the context of the UN General Assembly, we wanted to address how the international system is failing or is kind of finding it hard to address these challenges, and what are the dynamics there. Welcome, Professor Küçükcan, once again. We discussed this already in private, of course, what kind of issues we would address today. How do you see it? The international system, when we say international system, of course, this is a liberal system led by the United States, at least until recently, and there's been a lot of sort of hesitation on the part of US policymakers to support that international system. And we've seen many shortcomings, if not failures, of this system in addressing the challenges and addressing the human suffering around the world and finding solutions even to the problems widespread in the West. So how do you see it, Professor Küçükcan?
Well, Kadir, thank you very much for raising such important questions just on the eve of UN General Assembly meetings in New York. I think the world leaders next week will also address some of the questions that we will be dealing today. When we look at the international system, I think we should have some sort of understanding of what it is and how it has emerged and what were the main objectives of such a, let's say, important structuring in the world. International system, as we see today, you said it is led by US. It is true that, largely it is led by US, but there are lots of challenges towards US power and authority in the last 2 decades at least. This current system is the legacy of the Second World War. Right after the Second World War, we have seen the emergence of this liberal world, in a sense, based on human rights, development ideas, peace and security, because until the Second World War, we haven't seen a dominant system or the institutions that you referred in the beginning of your introduction. And after the Second World War, the US led the world to establish a new order, let's say, which would prevent catastrophic events like the Second World War. When you look at the Second World War, I think it was one of the biggest disasters in the human history. Millions of people lost their lives, and human suffering reached its peak. We have seen the Holocaust. We have seen changing of borders, migration, refugees at the time as well. After the Second World War, of course, we have seen the emergence of UN as a organization, as an institution that is supposed to be representative of the whole world, that is supposed to be embracing all nation states rather than being controlled by a section of the world powers. However, we have, I think, witnessed all over the world since even the beginning of the UN system, which is now 76 years old, I mean, almost a century, quarter of a century. This system is now heavily criticized. I think there are some legitimate grounds of this sort of criticism when it comes to whether the UN system delivered what it has promised in the beginning. Secondly, but we should also acknowledge that, UN system also contributed to the rise and I think consolidation of multilateralism for a long time. And I mean, while we talk about critique of the UN and reform needs, we should also, I think, acknowledge the successes and achievements of that system. Otherwise, without having any central organization as such, things would have been, I think, much worse. Having said that, I think when we look at the concept of international system, I think we need to also talk about global governance, because when we talk about crisis, when we talk about refugees, when we talk about economic issues, climate change, we are talking about some common issues, not necessarily confined to one nation state. These areas, these crises needs to be addressed by a common voice. And UN is supposed to be that common voice, but when we look at the crises that are still continuing today, I think those who say that the UN needs to be reformed, I think they have a very strong and legitimate ground. Not only UN, but also some other institutions related to UN and others, like the World Trade Organization, IMF. These sort of organizations also, I think, failed in delivering what they have promised in the beginning. I think we need to look at such issues from a global perspective rather than a perspective of one nation state, because the rise of nationalism, rise of populism, I think also these are detrimental to the multilateralism of the UN system. I think that's what I can start with.
Yes, so one of the obviously structural problems at the UN is the UN Security Council that is, that privileges 5 great nations with special privileges, namely the veto power, and the decisions of the rest of the UN, when all the countries are participating in a specific decision, it doesn't have enforcement power unless the UN Security Council actually enforces that decision and goes, follows up. And we've seen over the years, this has largely meant that if the US wanted something to be done at the UN Security Council, they would push hard, and then they would negotiate with, powers like Russia and China and others. And then if Russia wanted something done, then again, they would negotiate between the 5 of them essentially. But in recent years, that was down to 3 powers, US and Russia and China mostly. How do you see that contributing to the sort of the dysfunctionality in many ways of the that ideal you described, right? The UN was supposed to sort of secure peace around the world and be the voice of the sort of common voice of all nations.
Kadir, United Nations system is based on 3 major pillars. One of them is peace and security. And let's look around whether peace and security are really well established and protected. Look at Middle East, look at Africa, look at some of the Asian countries. Look at US itself. I mean, we have seen how divided it was, let alone the rest of the world. And I think peace and security is still something that we hope for. Look at Afghanistan, the withdrawal of, I think, US also, I think, contributes to our criticism of the current system. The second pillar was protection of human rights, institutionalization and protection of human rights. But let's look around again, violation of human rights, and also, I think, in many countries, the rise of authoritarianism. To what extent UN system helped us to resolve some of the issues. The third one is development. I think when you look at the large divide between North and South, when you look at how many people are living under the poverty today, I think you will address in a few minutes one of the examples of, I think our discussion will be COVID. COVID is not only a health crisis. I think these are all areas when you look at today, there are a lot of challenges that we face. And I think even in some developed countries, we can see such challenges that we are facing. And UN, yes, maybe tried to help us, but it did not really resolve. Let's look at, for example, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. To what extent this organization is successful. Yes, we might have well intentions, but given the rise of nationalism, as I said, and divergence between the permanent members of the Security Council, divergence of their national interests, what we see that those issues are supposed to be globally managed, but the UN seems to be far from it. And I think Turkey was one of the first voices, as you would remember, critiquing this system, because this is not equal. This is there is no equal representation. There are 193 countries. We have seen that UN has expanded, and we have also seen that new powers emerged, and new blocs emerged, like the Muslim world, Asian powers, etc. But the system has been established 75 years ago, and it is static. And Turkey says, for example, the Recep Tayyip Erdogan has already, I think, indicated that probably next week he will talk about this critique, that UN needs to be reformed in order to be more inclusive. And I just would like to ask you, for example, when it comes to the global governance of the global problems like COVID-19, what is the success, the failure approach of the UN, how it is received in especially in the countries that has been supporting the UN system? In other countries, of course, we know the position, but how US, China, Russia, and other two members in the Security Council can legitimize what's happening in the UN system today.
Well, as you pointed out, UN has been largely left out of the especially the challenge of COVID-19. And on that front, we saw, World Health Organization as one of those international organizations that was supposed to lead the world. But as you would remember, right at the beginning, the World Health Organization quickly became politicized. It was accused of either not properly informing the public or being late. And remember that fatal tweet that they sent out saying that they received reassurances from China that the virus was not contagious or not as contagious and airborne, etc. So the organizations that were set up to address these challenges were not moving especially in COVID-19's start. They couldn't establish their credibility as a global voice on this, global authoritative voice. They couldn't bring together China, US, and others to find the source of the virus very quickly, right? Identify it and maybe create an international group of scientists to advise the world. So it became very politicized very quickly, and ever since, I don't think many nations or many people around the world are really paying a lot of attention to World Health Organization. But that's the premier, that was supposed to be the premier institution that was supposed to guide us when there was a pandemic. Of course, in previous pandemics, especially the US and West coming out and leading the global efforts helped a lot. But again, they needed the expertise and support from these institutions, and we saw that not happening, unfortunately, in the COVID-19 crisis. Of course, besides the UN and WHO, there's other institutions, right, that is supposed to help the international system create safety and security, right? NATO, let's say, economic stability, perhaps IMF, and then there is more recent G20. So how do you see those other kind of pillars of the international system yourself? How well are they functioning, or whether they're functioning? Like, I can give you an example. G20 is the most, the biggest 20 economies, but we've seen the convening of G8, for instance, and then more narrow sort of group of countries coming together and making decisions and trying to create this kind of engine power for the rest of the world to accept it. But I feel like it remains often localized and fractured. How do you see them operating in this increasingly unstable environment?
Kadir, as you have just suggested, I think there are many issues all around the world. Some of them are regional issues, some are national issues. Of course, we talk about global issues like COVID-19 as well. I think let me briefly address COVID-19 and how the international community and the system, I think, have failed to address that question. We have seen that during the COVID-19, of course, these organizations that you referred to, they were supposed to lead us. They were supposed to, I think, come forward and also raise finance, as well as some norms, because these organizations are producing norms and principles that we are supposed to adhere to. I think this is something that they completely failed. And also, as I said, because of the rise of this populism and nationalism, countries do not subscribe to the ideals and norms of those organizations anymore. Why? Because such organizations do not have the power, or they don't want to exert their power on the countries that are diverging from the principles and norms. This is one of the issues that we have. You know, many countries sign documents of the UN, we know that, and other organizations as well. But when it comes to whether such principles are practiced, whether such principles are turned into a practice in real life, this is something that we do not see. And when it comes to COVID-19, I think COVID-19 is much beyond a health crisis. It is a, I think, crisis of humanity. It's a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of security, crisis of education. I think the recent reports, I'm sure you have seen that, for the first time in the world history, for the first time, 1.5 billion students, they did not have education last year, or in the last 2 years almost. And 500,000 of them, 500,000 of them, they did not have any access to proper education at all. You can see the enormity of the problem. But what we have seen again this vaccine nationalism. Each and every country, they grabbed something for themselves and they did not want to share it. Today, look at Africa and to what extent Africans do have access to vaccine. Very few, very little. And yet we see that, you know, globalization is taking place. People will travel. People will try to engage with each other. Trade will continue. And unless the international system can manage this crisis as a whole, what will happen? What will happen? We have seen in the past, you have, I think, rightly alluded to, we have seen the rise of regional organizations. We have seen new blocs, because I think they don't want to trust international system anymore. Therefore, they try to find their own solutions, and that will create a lot of, I think, new problems. Let's look at the invasion of Crimea by Russia. What did United Nations do? What did EU do? What did NATO do? Nothing. And that's, you can see how one country can really damage the international system, because the international system, as we see, helpless. Let's look at the Syrian issue. I think Turkey also made a case here. Turkey said to the Arab world, to the OIC and the UN, as we can see, regional organizations, global organizations, international organizations, Turkey called for example, no-fly zone. Turkey called for humanitarian aid in the region. What is the result, Kadir? I think all the organizations and new structures that we have mentioned, they have also, I think, not managed things easily, simply because there is, I think, lack of will. There is lack of maybe understanding, or there is lack of addressing such issues. Why? Because, you know, for Americans, for many Europeans, for many maybe Russians, the crisis in the Middle East or crisis in Palestine, for example, you know, it is not relevant to them. But that makes people lose their confidence in international system. And I think you can maybe give more examples. Look at the refugee crisis. How do you think refugee crisis is handled by the countries, organizations, as you have just mentioned.
You're right. I mean, as you described and I mentioned earlier, the UN is unable to act often in the face of these crises, largely because the interests of the great powers do not align with the resolution of the problem, but their interests often align with sort of managing the crisis with some quote unquote, acceptable collateral damage along the way. So if millions of refugees are moving to Turkey, it's not a problem in itself unless it threatens security in Europe, for instance. Then the Europeans start scrambling and try to find a solution that is highly securitized too. It's not based on human rights principles that the EU preached for a long time. We see, for instance, Russia and China advocating the sovereignty, national sovereignty of nations, and not meddling in their internal affairs. But we see them very active in quite a few conflict zones, including Libya and Syria. So the great powers that are supposed to be sort of protecting the international system, the rule of law for all the nations to abide by, when it directly impacts their national interest, they don't, and they have the veto power to stop those institutions from taking any meaningful decision. We saw that in Syria. There hasn't been any meaningful resolution from the UN Security Council. Not even that. Actually, remember several months ago, Russia was threatening to block humanitarian aid that is entering Syria from Turkey. So it is being politicized even at that level. So in many ways, the UN system is increasingly becoming, less relevant. And like you said, the populations around the world do not believe in the promise of that, international system that could deliver some sort of justice, some sort of security, and then they do revert to, like you said, populist politicians' promises. We see that in the COVID-19 crisis, right? Some of the first things nations did was to block any kind of export of protectional PPE, right? The health workers needed those, and we didn't see them exported. Turkey did a lot. Turkey tried to produce to many, I think about 60 countries, but we've seen many nations fail on that front. Both China and US, they either blocked the exports or gave that aid selectively for political purposes. We saw China trying to send it to Italy, and like you mentioned, the same kind of issue is happening with vaccine access. The West has a lot of vaccines right now, but they're discussing third shots while booster shots, while much of the world does not even have any access to the first shot. And we've seen also, like you mentioned, education in an age of disinformation that is even more crucial. We've lost, much of the world lost a year and a half or 2 years of proper education for their children, and that's not necessarily the case in the West. But when we're talking about global problems are global problems. They're not national problems, right? How do you see when nations are increasingly trying to find national solutions to global problems? Because the virus doesn't stop at the borders. The refugees cannot be contained to stay in a specific country. And climate change is impacting millions of people who will end up in other countries. So how do you see that contradiction, that inconsistency?
I think there is some sort of political blindness among the leaders. Simply because when we talk about some of the issues like migration, like asylum, many might assume that this is a national problem. In fact, it is not a national problem. It goes beyond borders. When we look at the refugee issue today, according to UN statistics, these are registered. It may be even higher than that. 82 million people are displaced. They were displaced by force. They were kicked out of their homeland, their property, their country. And this is not a national problem at all. And this is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. I think we have seen the most striking example during the Syrian crisis. In 2015, we have seen that almost 1 million people went to gates of European Union. And we have seen the response in the European Union at the time. And then I think all of a sudden they had some sort of enlightenment and awakening that, this is a problem. Yes, it is in Syria, thousands of miles away from our borders, but we need to address that issue. Turkey and European Union made a deal, and this irregular migration stopped to Europe. There is a similar issue in many other countries. So look at the refugee flows. I think this is a telling story today. Look at Afghanistan today. More than, I think, 3 million people already left Afghanistan, and there is people fear that there might be another wave of migration. Idlib, there is an Idlib crisis going on. Yes, there is at the moment maybe relative stability over there, but in the last couple of days we see that regime is bombing some areas, and there are almost 4 million people living in Idlib. It's a small, I think, town. So we can see that these issues are not local and national anymore. And what happens if they cannot find help from the international community? I think, as I said, the pillar of the peace and security or development and human rights, they will be ruined completely because individual countries will take their own measures in order to stop that wave, for example, and they would not recognize UN norms, protection of human rights, etc., or security of those people. I think we have seen this in Rwanda. Just remember, UN completely failed in Rwanda, and more than 1 million people lost their lives in Africa. I think Africans deserve better. And there is, I think, a similar issue that the future seems to be, in that sense, not very promising when it comes to the intervention and influence of the international system. Therefore, there is a lot of questioning of international system today, and I think that will continue as long as this, I think, trend will continue. And look at the divide between South and North. I think this is a very well, I think, a conceptualized issue when it comes to the governance of global issues. What is the influence of the South? What is the influence of the North? Who is leading? And what is the reaction among the southern countries when it comes to economy, poverty, hunger, and education? Education is supposed to be very much, I think, associated with the economic development of the countries. We are talking about manpower. We are talking about human capital. And it seems that there is at the moment a crisis, and that crisis is becoming some sort of status quo. Syrian crisis is a status quo. Palestinian issue, more than 5 million Palestinians are refugees here and there. It is a status quo. Now, I think we need to address that issue as well. The global, some regional issues and some global issues like COVID are becoming status quo, and the international community seems to be not responding efficiently.
You're right. These both regional and global problems, they are becoming more and more protracted, and there doesn't seem to be an urgency, for the international organizations to move in and act with, so that kind of urgency to resolve the issues so that they don't grow. But we have moved into a space, like you said, it's sort of years and years of, refugee challenge seems to be acceptable. COVID kind of not being able to get back to normal activities, economic activities, that is becoming also normal. And, you know, conflicts around the world, it's the same thing. So do you feel like we have lost, I mean, we've discussed this, we've lost quite a lot of belief in the multilateralism, and we've seen sort of, you know, populist leader like Trump lost his power in the US, and Biden administration came and he promised multilateralism and consultations with Europe and strengthening the West, and he talked about sort of US plus EU would amount to 60% of world economy, so we can, you know, re-establish the multilateralism and international organizations and breathe life into them. But then the first big challenge, we talked about this, right? In Afghanistan, US said, okay, I'm pulling out. It didn't even properly consult the NATO allies. So this seems to be some sort of a crisis of multilateralism, but at the same time, many nations are continuing to show up to the UN and making speeches and making calls, including Turkey. How do you feel that will evolve in the years ahead? Like, if there is this, do you feel like this crisis of multilateralism will increase or decrease?
I think when we look at the history, we might, you know, argue with some strength that the multilateralism worked until the end of the Cold War much better than today. Okay, I mean, we need to, I think, acknowledge that multilateralism was something that needed after the Second World War in order to avoid similar catastrophic incidents. Okay. And because there was two camps, you know, Soviet Union on the one hand, and on the other hand, US-led Western liberal powers. So it's, despite the fact that there were many problems, I think it worked to some extent, and there was not much of a criticism as we see today. After the, of course, Cold War, we have seen that, you know, the shift, the international organizations, international powers. We have seen a lot of, I think, transformation in the world politics. We have seen rise of new nations, rise of new powers. They also tried to, I think, influence the agenda, and also they wanted to claim their, let's say, share from the wealth of the world. I think that has created some kind of momentum that has damaged the multilateralism. Now, I think one needs to ask a question. What is the alternative to multilateralism? It is for this reason, I think, Kadir, that many people are, and the leaders are coming to New York, and they are trying to revive the spirit of the UN. Because the alternative is something that is more fragmented world. More, I think, fragmented, divided, regionalized. I think that would not help us to address some of the questions that you have already raised. Therefore, my hope is to, I think, revive multilateralism on the basis of equal representation, rather than being led by only a superpower like America or Russia or some other powers. There should be some sort of, I think, a new understanding of the UN system. More and more countries should be allowed into a veto power Security Council, not only 5 countries. They may remain there, but I think that should be more representative. And as I said, I mean, the alternative is not something that we need to invest. Alternative is more fragmentation. However, if there is no, I think, restoration of the multilateralism, I think people will move into more fragmented world. That means more crisis. That means more catastrophe. That means more, let's say, I think, less security, less wealth, less peace, in my view. That's what I can say as far as the future of the multilateralism is concerned. I mean, my hope is that it will be revived. But when we look at the reality, maybe you can summarize as the reality. You have already said that, you know, US has withdrawn from Afghanistan. It was a unilateral decision. When you look at China, when you look at Russia, in their, I think, international and foreign relations, they are prioritizing their national interests. How do you think the balance can be established between national interests and the global governance so that multilateralism can be given a new spirit and voice?
Well, it's a hard balance, and we are seeing that, right? The United States sponsored this international liberal system, and it was ready to make the necessary kind of sacrifices and sort of. For instance, when we look at Iran nuclear issue during the time of Obama, they spent about 9 months talking to Russians and, you know, Chinese, because imposing US sanctions on Iran does not really by itself sort of bring Iran to the negotiation table. They need to run out of options. The only way to ensure that is to go and do diplomacy with Russia and China and give and take and create a more common front where Iran recognizes, okay, I'm getting sanctioned, but I'm not getting much help from Iran and Russia, so I guess I have to make a deal with this broader coalition. So we're seeing some of that happen, I think, on specific issues. For instance, US mentioned that, okay, on climate, we can work with China, but on other things we won't. So the problem with that, right, the sort of creating alliances around issues is that, you know, those issues start being managed rather than resolved, and it takes kind of, they resolve it against these greater principles, right? So for instance, in Libya, you know, at some point, US helped, you know, bring down the Gaddafi regime using the responsibility to protect a principle, but then it wouldn't use that principle anywhere else. It refused to use it in Syria. So next time around, nobody will allow that to happen. So what kind of principles can you organize nations around, right? That is the big challenge. Like I mentioned earlier, this is true for other nations when they talk about, oh, don't meddle in our internal affairs, but then they do. They, you know, liberal nations don't take that seriously either. So we are just about any principle you mentioned, right? Human rights and securing peace and security. On just about any topic, it's hard for nations to come around and commit around the concept, commit to certain principles and apply them consistently. And, you know, ideally, they should come around and create a new structure. We are seeing that happen on economy, on, you know, climate change, on COVID-19, small groupings around different topics, but that doesn't take us to a broader multilateral system that is healthier. So nations like, you know, Turkey, we can talk about Turkey a little bit more, I think. They feel stuck in many ways, right? They have to deal with the refugee challenge, but when they call on the international community to help, only those who are directly impacted care about it, but then their help is not meaningful either. So I think it's a complex, difficult story to address, a challenge to address, to be honest. But I do agree with you. I mean, the opposite of multilateralism is nationalism, and sort of all countries just chasing their national interest as they see it, and then we have kind of a chaotic situation. We can't arrive at a more stable system based on rule of law. So
can I come in here?
Sure,
Kadir, can I come in here? When we talk about, you know, this stable world, one of the, I think, greatest challenges today is terrorism. and the violence that we see in many parts of the world today. In many contexts, I think we can see that. I think one reason is that, as you have mentioned, there is lack of authority. There is lack of norms. Normative values have been, I think, going away, not influential anymore. I think if you look at the emergence of non-state actors in the last 10 years, you will see that they are popping up like mushrooms all around the world. And one reason is that because the nation states fail to cooperate with each other. Look at the support of US to YPG in the Middle East, in North Syria. On the one hand, US is saying that they will pursue a policy against terrorism. That's why they went to Afghanistan. That's why they invaded Iraq. But today, there is a tacit and very active support of US towards YPG. This contradiction in itself is something that will damage the image of a country, and also it will cause, I think, lack of confidence between the countries. This will, I think, something that should be addressed. Why we see emergence of non-state actors here and there? Because there is no overarching principles anymore that the countries are supposed to submit to such normative values.
That's exactly right. I mean, we see nations, bigger powers, so big powers, abiding by the international law as long as it serves their interests. So we see them acting in a unilateral fashion and basically aligning with whoever is available to them, disregarding the international law, disregarding the interests, national interests of their closest allies like Turkey, a NATO ally. So we are almost at the end of our program today. We tried to address some of the challenges and the structural problems and actual issues facing the international community that is in New York right now, trying to find some solutions to the world's issues. I think this topic will constantly come back, and we will address this, and maybe hopefully next week we will talk more specifically about world leaders' messages and what they're saying and how they see the world at this time. So Professor Küçükcan, unless you have anything to add, I would like to close our program today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Kadir. I would just say action speaks louder than words. So we will see next week whether the words or the actions are more prominent.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Küçükcan, and thank you to those who are following this program. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.